podcast is brought to you by Schema Business School.
Coming next, we discuss the challenge of sustainable globalization, in particular the shift from sustainable climate to sustainable development. Indeed, so far we have devoted a lot of time and attention to the economic, trade and financial issues in globalization. And we have defined globalization as a worldwide extension of the market economy. We have also defined sustainable development as a combination of economic growth, of course, plus sustainable policies, plus governance. Sustainable policies are not only a matter of investment, banking, but also climate, farming, industry, and sustainable industrial policies. So in fact, development is a lot more complex than economic growth. It's basically the quality of long-term economic sustainable growth. Indeed, we have to look now at the issue of global warming. And why? Because global economic growth leads to global warming. And global warming, in fact, decreases the scope for sustainable development. We have here a contradiction which is being tackled today, by the so-called challenge of natural resources depletion and debate on the natural limits to economic growth. Global warming is a complex matter, a hot issue. And why? Because in fact it is not the flow of incremental gas emissions in any specific year, it is the stock accumulation of greenhouse gases that basically impacts on the global average temperature. Global emissions stay in the atmosphere for at least a century. So whatever we do today will have an impact in 2050. The lag between the accumulation of gases and the temperature level means that temperature gradually gets affected by the stock of greenhouse gases. And emissions of the next decades will have an effect on the climate for a much longer period of time. Global warming leads to climate change. And climate change stems from the gradual change in the global temperature caused by the accumulation of greenhouse gases. These greenhouse gases themselves stem from the infrared radiation, which is trapped by the Earth's surface like a blanket of gases around the Earth that keep it warm and warmer and warmer. And this has a large impact on ecosystems. A good deal of these infrared radiations get back to the atmosphere, sort of boomerang impact. But the largest share gets trapped on the surface of the Earth, hence warming it. These gases stem from a good deal of economic, industrial, agricultural activities, including electricity uses, including combustion, including vehicles, transportation, also waste disposal, and of course business travel, airplanes. All these activities in the industrial and agricultural fields contribute to larger and larger greenhouse emissions, which today are close to about 8.4 billion tons per year. Many people criticize the hypothesis of close links between greenhouse emissions and temperature change. But that's a fact. If we look at a long-term series from the Middle Age until today, we see that a major and abrupt change in average temperature took place in around 1900. And why? Basically because it is at the time of the takeoff, the economic takeoff of the capitalist world economy, at the time of the Industrial Revolution. And we have a major structural economic shift with growing emissions of gases. The fear today is that without any change in consumption and production systems, temperature would on average increase by 2% above the pre-industrial years. This would have an impact, of course, on both developing and developed countries. The Industrial Revolution is really the trigger of this temperature change. It's fairly clear that industrial production and consumption behavior have a large impact on temperature changes. Look on the screen, for example, we have between 1850 and 1900 a gradual increase, but moderate in temperature. And suddenly we have a watershed in the 1950s, an acceleration of industrial development, and this leads to rapid increase in temperature. There is a close correlation between temperature increases and greenhouse gases. The two move hand in hand, neck to neck. And it is only in the 1950s that there is a skyrocketing increase in greenhouse gases, leading to higher and higher temperatures. Most of these CO2 emissions are produced by fossil fuels, as we shall see, coal, peat, gas, and oil. And roughly half of these CO2 emissions are contributed by only 3 regions in the world, fast-growing regions, namely the US, the EU, and China. And this, as you can see, takes place in the 1950s with the economic growth rate acceleration. Of course, the development of carbon dioxide emissions are not similar depending on the economic system of countries. The developed industrialized countries have produced earlier large fuel-based emissions since the 1850s, whereas the developing countries catch up on the growth process later, and they start developing their fuel-based emissions only at the time of the takeoff in the 1970s. And in the meantime, developed countries tend to decrease their land-based emissions, whereas they are still fairly large in the case of the developing countries. Coal, peat, oil, gas contribute for the large part to the CO2 emissions, and the majority is basically the fact of 2 contributions: coal, peat, and oil. Now, who are the main energy polluters? And who are the main energy consumers? Who is to be blamed? Consumers? Producers? Developing or developed countries? And how to measure pollution? Well, if we look at the total energy consumption in the world, in terms of millions of tons of oil equivalent, well, it's very clear. The US is now number 2. China is the largest energy consumer. Of course, if you divide energy consumption per capita, as we should probably, China is well below the US, and the US is still the largest energy consumer, slightly declining, probably due to the global crisis, probably one of the only beneficial consequence of the global recession is a slight downturn in energy consumption. Oil consumption is fairly large as part of total energy consumption, and the largest oil consumers are, for 45%, 3 regions: developed, USA, the EU, and Japan. These 3 consumers of oil fact, are close to the GDP distribution in the world, basically between three regions: the OECD, the US, Eastern Europe, and Japan. So it is not a surprise that the largest oil consumers are also those who hold the largest share of GDP today in the world. And in fact, China is still a long way behind, with around 14% of GDP. Coal consumers, totally different picture, because in fact coal is not much used in the OECD countries, or much larger in the developing countries, and China alone, contributes to half of the total coal consumers. A major challenge, of course, a major structural challenge, in China, to move out of this fossil fuels energy production. Projecting the graphs until 2035, coal-fired electricity will decline gradually in the most developed countries, the OECD, whereas China will have a tough time to stabilize its coal share of production in electricity generation. It will take time for China to move out of coal to gas, and maybe from gas to hydroelectric and nuclear energy. This stabilization of coal and oil-generated electricity in developed countries can be observed by looking at the EU, the share of renewable energy in the total energy consumption. On average, it is small. It is only less than 10% today for the EU. But countries, in particular in the Scandinavian region, such as Sweden, Austria, Finland, and Denmark, have managed to boost the total share of their renewable energy to around 25 up to 37% for Sweden. Pollution now. Who pollutes more? Well, the EU, the USA, and China contribute to around 65% of total pollution. So pollution in the world is extremely concentrated in one fast-growing region, China, and those countries, who have a long history of industrial economic growth, the EU and the US. CO2 emissions are there extremely concentrated into the OECD, the USA, Europe, Soviet Union, China. We see that Latin America and Africa are basically still less contributors to CO2 emissions. If we get the global picture of CO2 emissions per country, we see that they are extremely concentrated on a few countries, in particular the US, China, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union. And indeed, the largest CO2 emissions come from China, US, the EU, India, and Russia. France has a relatively meager contribution to CO2 emissions. But if we move, in fact, as we should, to CO2 emissions per capita, we have a totally different picture. Then China is not much contributing, in fact, more moderately. The Soviet Union or Russia is a large contributor, with the US economy and with Australia. Indeed, per capita, you see that Australia is still today, in terms of tons per capita of CO2 emissions, followed by the USA, Japan, China, and France has not now, a small share of CO2 emissions per capita. France is almost close to China. This CO2 emission contribution can be used as a measure of economic performance, of economic efficiency, if you will. In fact, we can use a ratio of the carbon dioxide emission to produce $1 of GDP. In the case of a Chinese economic system, the efficiency is not very good. For $1 of GDP, China will emit 0.25 to 23 kilos of carbon dioxide, whereas in the USA it's 0.1 and in France 0.05 kilogram of carbon dioxide for every dollar of GDP production. In China today, each citizen produces roughly 20% of all greenhouse gases. But this will change as China catches up with developed countries in terms of automobile, cars, in terms of residential electricity, people moving from the west of China to the cities on the east coast. All this will have an impact, of course, on energy consumption, hence on greenhouse gases. Which means that if we look at the long term, 20 and 30, the USA probably, because of better efficiency of production, will have a slight decrease in overall CO2 emissions, whereas Russia probably will increase, China will increase, and Brazil will increase. So decline in CO2 emissions will probably be only for a few countries, USA, the EU, and maybe Japan. As we can see on the table, the production of CO2 gases stems from a number of developed countries, whereas the lower middle-income countries still generate a relatively modest contribution. China, 24% of total greenhouse emissions, plus the US, plus the EU at 27%. We see that basically these three regions contribute for 60% of total greenhouse gases. And then the curve flattens, hence a heavy concentration of CO2 emissions in a few countries. A good measure of the economic efficiency in the US can be observed on the chart, where we see that as GDP increases, emissions tend to flatten. Hence, we have a positive gap between the GDP in the US and a better intensity of energy production, with less greenhouse gas emissions. But what are the consequences, the impact on global economic growth and the prospects for developed and developing countries? Well, we are all in the same boat, that in fact products of globalization, as I've been telling you many times, globalization is basically an echo chamber. And whatever happens in one country has an impact on all over the world. Well, an increase in global temperature will have sharp impact on food production, on water availability, on ecosystems, and of course in extreme changes in temperature and climate. The impact will be rising sea levels, desertification, drought, deforestation, temperature increases, heavy rainfalls. And this will have an impact, on migration and on consumption. By 2030, probably more than 56% of total people living in developing countries will live in cities. There will be some benefits for a few countries from a few developed countries. For example, in Canada, Russia, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, probably higher agricultural yields as temperature will decrease, lower winter mortality, lower heating requirements, maybe good impact on tourism, who knows, But the threats are large. Storm, heat waves, and more volatility in cost of insurance and capital. Higher risk, basically, of investment. A 2% increase in temperature might lead to a 20% reduction in water availability and crop yields in southern Europe and in California. All in all, extreme weather changes might cost close to 1% of GDP, global GDP, by 2050. On developing countries, this will have tremendous impact. GDP's growth might decline, hence negative consequence for the poor. Climate change will lead to obstacles to sustainable development. It will lead to less of poverty eradication. Climate change will basically lead to poverty. And climate change will impact on poverty basically because developing countries are vulnerable to geographic exposure, to greater reliance on agriculture development and on climate. This can be easily illustrated by looking at the chart. On the one side, we have in red the GNI, gross national income per capita. The highest countries on the right part of the screen, Luxembourg, and the UK, Belgium, Italy, and so on. On the left side, we have those countries, the poorer countries in the world, like Burundi and Burkina Faso. Well, the poorer countries in the world are those where agriculture value added is a very large contribution to GDP, hence vulnerability to climate change. In those countries, in Africa basically, well, up to 50% of total GDP is coming from agriculture. And this is, of course, the sector most sensitive to climate change and temperature changes. The risk of doing nothing, business as usual, is large. By 2100, climate change and GDP losses could mean that 145 million people would fall into poverty. And by poverty, I mean less than $2 per day. Where would these people live? South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, of course. And under the worst scenario, well, this number of people falling into poverty would reach close to 220 million people. We can observe, that the major impact of climate change would be in the tropical zones where millions of people, live in the developing countries. South America, Eastern Europe, and Africa. Water stress and drought risk. Crop yield reduction, same story, mainly Sub-Saharan Africa and Central America. Flooding risk in the East, Southeast Asia, as we know well, Thailand, Bangladesh. Well, what can and what should be done to tackle these global challenges of climate change? There has been a number of meetings, conferences, reports, starting with the Club of Rome report back in 1972 until the Durban meeting last year in November 2011. Nothing much happened. The Kyoto Protocol back in 1997 provided that the EU would contribute to an 8% reduction in greenhouse gases. And until 2020, the EU went to a larger scale, predicting a 20% target of reduction, provided that other countries join the European effort. Each should take its responsibility and participating in this overall global effort. So the EU was in fact ready to get up to 30% reduction by 2020. This was in line with the Millennium Objectives of the US, which was to ensure environmental sustainability by imposing on countries a cut in global CO2 emissions. The US government took drastic action, not only in 2008, but 1 year later with Obama's budget in 2009, which passed a $112 billion budget to move into renewable energies, better efficiency, and emission-reducing activities. This amount of money is substantial. It is, in fact, threatened by the US Congress, but $112 billion is, in fact, number 2 just after China, which has a budget to fight greenhouse emissions and global warming twice as large as the US, $221 billion. Then we have much smaller budget efforts. In the EU, only 23, and in Canada, only $3 billion. So we see that the largest financial ammunition to fight greenhouse emissions stem from 2 of the largest countries in the world, China and the US. Well, what to do next? Well, doing nothing, in case of recession and crisis, produces automatically a reduction in CO2 emissions. It is the case in the US, where CO2 emissions have decreased with the slowdown of US GDP. The EU has set, a conditional target of a 20% emission reduction, but conditional on other countries' efforts. And something little, comes from other countries, which is a good reason to do nothing. And in today's economic crisis, the challenge is still tougher with lower growth and budget restrictions. So in fact, it's a total turnaround in economic strategy which is required. The grow or die, law of survival means that there is an endless competition to produce more, and producing more means also consuming more and larger amount of CO2 emissions and global warming. And this, in fact, has a lot to do with what we have discussed earlier in terms of the short-term horizon of market economic forces at the expense of a long-term vision, to modify the strategy of economic development. There are 2 schools of thought which discusses, what to do. The alternative to free will, short-sighted economic growth. The first one is a so-called steady state economy. It means that capitalism can be reshuffled, can be modified, in order to stop growing quantitatively, but it would continue to develop internally. So the quality of growth would be better, even though GDP would stop growing. The Sustainable Development School says that capitalism can in fact continue growing, as long as there is a green industrial revolution that countries embark on renewable energies. And this is a matter, number 1, of budget spending, and number 2, on international coordination. In the first school, we have Herman Daly. In the second, we have Paul Hawken and Lester Brown. But whatever the school, there's a consensus to conclude that things cannot continue, they cannot last forever, because in fact, the consumption in the world gets 44% faster than the nature replenishment of resources. Whatever the school's approach to climate change, there's a consensus to conclude that things cannot last for long, things cannot continue. And why? Because in fact, consumption gets 44% faster than the natural replenishment of resources. So in fact, if the world's economy would continue to consume at the same pace, it would require more than 3.5 planets like Earth. What is at stake is the capitalist system of production. How is all this related to globalization? Should we have, less or more globalization? Several scholars, in the green camp, argue for de-globalizing the market economy. But in a sense, I don't think it's a nice way to move towards reliance on national territories. In fact, the challenge is so global, so structural, it requires global action. So the name of the game, is how growing not more, but better. How to promote global governance, how to promote international coordination, not only within the OECD-rich countries, using better policy coordination, but also how to get to a closer partnership with emerging market countries. And this requires not only financial flows, but also probably technology transfers, FDI, financial foreign direct investment, and also probably a larger say of developing countries in institutional organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, and WTO. But it is a whole global governance architecture which has to be challenged in order to move into sustainable global development. Thank you.